ley lines, right? So this is something that's a very old sort of science. So there are lines that run around the earth. They form a grid, and they're called ley lines. And they run and so they have a certain frequency to them. And in certain places, like you'll notice that it feels really good in that space because the ley lines are converging in a way that feels good. And there are other places where, like for example, in San Francisco, where we used to live, okay? So generally speaking, that city is affluent, has culture, art, whatever, that kind of thing. For as long as I can remember, we lived there for only 20 years, and for many years before that, there's a street called 6th Street, where it's like everyone sort of down and out is there. There's a lot of drug use on that street. There's a lot of violent crime. It's on this street. I'm not saying there's no crime in San Francisco, okay? So please note, I did not say that.
But
this particular street is like this nexus for all of that sort of like yuck, that can happen in a city.
Low vibration.
Low resonance, very dense, like a lot of homelessness, a lot of drug use, a lot of mental disorder, a lot of like that, Doesn't feel particularly safe, it's dirty, like that kind of thing. Now, every city kind of has a place like this, and it all, it's like, why doesn't, and people have tried to revitalize that street, like all this stuff tries to happen, but it always dissolves. So there's a ley line that runs there, and it's actually where two converge. And therefore, in that space, it creates a dissonance, a low-level frequency resonance that attracts low-level frequency resonance. It creates it has a field that creates this kind of thing, right? Like that kind of like heavy, dark, dense distortion, right? And it's just because, imagine, like if you even equate it to sound, right? Like if you have a sound that's a grating and horrible.
Dissonance was a great word to describe. Yeah,
it's like that, right?
So things that are will be there.
Exactly. Exactly.
That makes sense.
Exactly.
And so the opposite's true. Maybe Sedona, I've never been, but I've heard like there's some magical areas there.
And there are ley lines where it's interesting, a lot of it's fascinating to me. A lot of churches are placed on powerful ley lines. It's very fascinating to me. Okay, so it's a lot of there's an interesting amount of control that can happen over ley lines because there's a lot of power in them.
Everybody feels good.
Yeah,
you can.
And there's a lot of power there. Yep, and so that's the thing with ley lines is that they can be very powerful, and a lot of not just churches but like old like ancient peoples would put their sacred places where ley lines.
How do we know where ley lines are?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things where they'll map the ley lines. You can see them. There are people who specialize in ley lines and will help consult and like where to put your is this house like in a good position
so
and that type of thing.
It wouldn't be considered a woo-woo thing. It's a thing that can be measured.
Yeah. So like people have been mapping this for a while. Okay. It's not like I'm pretty. I don't know if I'm the judge of
maybe I shouldn't word it.
But in any case, for me, like it's people have mapped this, right?
Yeah,
so this
people have
mapped it, right? So it's quite known, and there are people.
Mappable.
It's mappable, and there are people who know about them, and they specialize in where ley lines are, and there's a lot of science like around this, right? About mapping, about things like this, and. Speaking of science, I mean, like feng shui is also a form of science, right? It's like, because what is all of that? Ley lines and feng shui, it has to do with the qi, right? Like how is energy moving in this physical space? Yeah. And how does it affect it? Now, ley lines, to me, have to do with resonance, right? So when you're in a powerful ley line, it actually amplifies the power or whatever it is that's in that space. It's positive. It can also be negative, like in that bad part of town.